In the vast Montana territory of 1893, sometimes the most unexpected arrivals change everything. Montgomery Hawley owned 500,000 acres of prime cattle land, but his grand ranch house echoed with the hollow sound of loneliness. When he posted a simple advertisement for a cook, he expected a weathered trailhand who could fry bacon and brew strong coffee. Instead, a widow with twin daughters stepped off the dusty stagecoach, carrying nothing but hope and a carpetbag full of dreams. Cora Whitfield had lost her husband to the river, her home to debt, and nearly her faith in tomorrow. But she possessed something Monty's money couldn't buy: the warm magic that transforms a house into a home. What neither of them knew was that their 2-week arrangement would ignite a battle for the ranch itself, testing whether love could triumph over greed and loneliness. Would a man who had everything but happiness risk it all for a family that wasn't his? The Silver Spur Ranch stretched across the golden Montana grasslands like a kingdom carved from dreams and determination. Montgomery Howell stood on the wraparound porch of his grand Victorian mansion, watching the morning sun paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and rose. 500,000 acres of prime cattle country rolled away in every direction, dotted with Aberdeen Angus that represented the finest breeding stock money could buy. Yet for all its magnificence, the ranch felt as empty as a cathedral after the last prayer has been whispered. Monty adjusted his leather vest and ran weathered fingers through graying hair that had once been as dark as winter nights. At 42, he possessed everything a man was supposed to want: land, livestock, and enough money in the Bozeman Bank to buy half the territory. But wealth, he had learned, made a poor companion for breakfast and an even poorer one for the long evenings that stretched like shadows across his polished hardwood floors. The mansion itself stood as a testament to his success and his solitude. 3 stories of imported lumber rose against the endless sky, complete with bay windows, ornate trim, and enough rooms to house a dozen families. Crystal chandeliers caught the morning light in the dining room, where he ate alone each day. There, prismatic reflections dancing across wallpaper, shipped from San Francisco. Persian rugs covered floors that rarely heard footsteps beyond his own, and the grand staircase curved upward toward bedrooms that had never known the sound of children's laughter or a woman's gentle voice. He had built it all for nothing, starting with a homestead claim and a handful of cattle when he was barely 20. His parents had died in the smallpox epidemic of 1871, leaving him orphaned and hungry on the streets of Helena. Those lean years had taught him that security came from hard work and careful planning, that a man could trust no one but himself. To ensure his survival, he had saved every penny, invested every dollar, and worked every daylight hour to transform his modest holdings into an empire that stretched beyond the horizon. The ranch employed 37 men during the busy season's cowboys, wranglers, and seasonal hands who respected his fair wages and firm leadership. They lived in the bunkhouse complex he had built near the main barn, a collection of sturdy buildings that provided comfortable quarters for men who worked hard and asked few questions about their boss's personal life. Chuck Morrison, his foreman, for 8 years, managed the day-to-day operations with the efficiency of a military commander and the loyalty of a blood brother. The other hand's men, like old Pete Carlson and young Jimmy Martinez, knew their business and did it well, creating a smooth-running operation that had made the Silver Spur legendary throughout the territory. But when the work was done, and the men returned to their quarters, Monty climbed the stairs to his private study and sat alone with his ledgers and his thoughts. He had tried to fill the silence with fine things books shipped from Chicago, a piano that arrived by wagon train, artwork that graced walls no one else would see. Nothing seemed to absorb the peculiar quiet that settled over a house built for a family but occupied by only one man. The idea of hiring a cook had come to him on a particularly lonely evening in late September. He was tired of eating meals prepared by the hotel in town, tired of the awkward small talk with strangers in the dining room, tired of returning to a kitchen that smelled of nothing but dust and disuse. A good cook would solve his practical problem and perhaps, he told himself, bring some warmth to the cold formality of his daily routine. The advertisement he placed in the Bozeman Gazette had been simple and straightforward. Cook wanted good pay, fair quarters, immediate hire. Apply in person at Silver Spur Ranch, 10 miles south of town. He expected responses from the usual suspects: aging cowboys looking for indoor work, widow women seeking respectable employment, perhaps a retired army cook tired of following. The flag. He had prepared a room above the kitchen, stocked it with basic furniture, and cleared a corner of his study to conduct interviews. What he had not prepared for was the sight that greeted him when the Tuesday stagecoach pulled up to his front gate on a crisp October morning. The driver, Bill Hawkins, climbed down with his usual grunt and began unloading luggage with the care of a man handling precious cargo. But instead of the grizzled trail cook Monty had envisioned, a slender woman emerged from the coach's interior, smoothing her dark wool skirt and adjusting a simple bonnet that framed a face marked by both determination and exhaustion. Cora. Whitfield possessed the kind of beauty that spoke of strength rather than fragility, high cheekbones that suggested Cherokee ancestry, eyes the color of storm clouds, and hands that showed the calluses of honest work. She wore widow's black, but the fabric was clean and well mended, speaking of pride maintained despite difficult circumstances. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had faced hardship and refused to surrender to it. But it was not Cora alone who stepped from that stagecoach. Two small figures emerged beside her, twin girls of perhaps 6 years, with their mother's striking features and their father's sturdy build. The first child, wearing a blue dress that had been carefully mended at the hem, possessed an air of serious concentration as she surveyed her new surroundings with mathematical precision. The second, dressed in green wool, bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement, her eyes darting everywhere, at once as if cataloging adventures yet to come. "Mr. Hull?" Cora's voice carried the subtle accent of someone raised along the river towns, musical but practical. "I'm Cora Whitfield. I've come about the cooking position." She gestured to the girls beside her, her chin lifting slightly in, a gesture Monty would come to recognize as her way of facing potential rejection. "These are my daughters, Josephine and Emma. I hope their presence won't be a problem." Monty stood frozen on his porch, hat in hand, staring at the small family that had materialized from a simple want advertisement. The girls, Josie and Emma. He corrected himself, watched him with the frank curiosity of children who had learned to judge adults quickly and accurately. They stood close to their mother's skirts, protective and protected, a unit forged by circumstance and strengthened by love. "I wasn't expecting." He began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence without giving offense. Children had never been part of his plan. The Silver Spur was a working ranch, dangerous and demanding, no place for small girls to run free. And yet, looking at Cora's carefully controlled expression and the quiet hope in her daughter's eyes, he found himself reconsidering assumptions he had held without question. "We won't be any trouble," Cora said quickly, misreading his hesitation. "The girls are well behaved and accustomed to keeping out of the way. I can cook and keep house, do laundry and mending. I worked in my husband's bakery for 12 years. Before," she paused, swallowing hard, "before the accident. I know my way around a kitchen, and I work hard for my wages." Emma, the more adventurous of the twins, stepped forward slightly. "Mama makes the best apple pies in all of Missouri," she announced with the confidence of someone stating an indisputable fact. "And Josie can count anything you want counted." She counted all the fence posts between here and town, and there's exactly 437. 438, Josie corrected quietly, her voice carrying the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with mathematical inexactitude. "You forgot the broken one by the creek." Despite himself, Monty felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. These were not the quiet, invisible children he might have tolerated. These were real little people with opinions and personalities, the kind who would transform his ordered world into something unpredictable and alive. The October wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwoods and carrying with it the scent of approaching weather. Clouds were building over the mountains, promising the kind of sudden storm that could turn Montana roads into impassable muddy tracks within hours. Sending a woman and 2 children back to town in such conditions would be not just unkind, but potentially dangerous. 2 weeks, he said finally, the words emerging from some part of himself he had thought long buried. I'll give you a 2-week trial. Room and board for all 3 of you, fair wages, and we'll see how it works out. He looked down at the girls, who were watching him with the intensity of small judges. But this is a working ranch. There are rules and there are dangers. You'll need to listen to your mother and stay out of trouble. Emma grinned, revealing a gap where her front tooth should have been. We're very good at staying out of trouble, she said solemnly, and added with devastating honesty, most of the time. Cora's relief was visible, though she kept her expression carefully controlled. Thank you, Mr. Hawley. We won't disappoint you. She gathered her daughters closer, a gesture both protective and grateful. Where would you like us to put our things? As Monty led them toward the house, he found himself wondering what he had just agreed to. His quiet, ordered world was about to become something entirely different, and for the first time in years, he was not entirely certain he could predict or control the outcome. The Silver Spur Ranch was about to discover what it meant to be a home instead of merely a property, and Montgomery Hawley was about to learn that some of life's most important lessons come in the smallest packages. The worn leather recipe book had traveled over 1,000 miles in Cora's carpetbag, its pages yellowed with age and stained with the honest marks of a working kitchen. As she unpacked it on the massive oak table that dominated the Silver Spur's kitchen, she ran her fingers over the familiar script of her grandmother's handwriting, recipes passed down through generations of women who had known the secret of transforming simple ingredients into something that nourished both body and soul. The kitchen itself was a marvel of modern convenience, larger than most people's entire homes, with a cast-iron range that could feed an army and cupboards that stretched toward the ceiling like cathedral spires. But for all its impressive fixtures and gleaming surfaces, it felt as cold and lifeless as a museum display. Cora could sense immediately that this room had been designed by someone who understood cooking as a necessity rather than an art, equipped by a man who saw meals as fuel rather than fellowship. She tied her apron strings and set to work, beginning with the simple task of lighting the range and assessing her supplies. A pantry revealed shelves stocked with basic staples flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, but nothing that spoke of creativity or comfort. No vanilla extract, no cinnamon, no dried fruits or nuts that could transform ordinary bread into something special. It was the pantry of a man who had never known the joy of coming home to the smell of fresh baking or the warmth of a kitchen where love was measured in carefully added seasonings. Josie and Emma had been given strict instructions to stay close and keep quiet while their mother worked, but even their whispered conversations seemed to breathe life into the sterile space. Josie perched on a wooden stool near the window, having already counted the panes of glass, 36, the number of copper pots hanging from their hooks, 14, and the blue and white plates arranged on the Welsh dresser, 43, including the chipped one on the bottom shelf. Emma stood on tiptoe beside the kitchen door, peering through the lace curtains at the ranch yard beyond, cataloging horses and cowboys and chickens with the enthusiasm of an explorer, discovering new continents. Cora's first meal was deliberately simple beef stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and apple butter made from a recipe her mother had taught her on an autumn afternoon, much like this one. But even simple food could carry the weight of memory and intention, and she found herself humming an old river song as she worked, the melody mixing with the sounds of simmering broth and the soft conversations of her daughters. The transformation began almost immediately. Ranch hands who had grown accustomed to eating in silence found themselves lingering over their plates, talking in voices that carried laughter instead of just instructions. Chuck Morrison, the weathered foreman who had supervised a dozen cooks, over the years, actually smiled when he tasted Cora's cornbread, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made him look 10 years younger. But it was Monty's reaction that surprised Cora most. He had eaten his meals alone in the formal dining room for so many years that the simple act of sharing a table seemed to unsettle him. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, hands folded carefully beside his plate, watching as Josie and Emma demonstrated their table manners with the careful precision of children who understood that good behavior was a form of currency. "This is very good," he said after his first spoonful of stew, the words coming out stiff and formal, as if he had forgotten how to offer a genuine compliment. "Much better than the hotel." Emma beamed at him across the expanse of polished wood. "Mama says food tastes better when it's made with happy hands," she announced, swinging her legs from the high-backed chair that was clearly designed for someone much taller. "Were your hands happy today, Mama?" "My hands are always happy. When?" "I'm cooking for people who appreciate it," Cora replied diplomatically, though she noticed the way Monty's expression softened at the exchange. There was something almost hungry in his face, and she suspected it had little to do with the meal before him. After dinner, while Cora cleaned the kitchen and settled the girls in the room Monty had hastily prepared above the pantry, she could hear him moving through the house below, footsteps that echoed differently now, as if the very walls were adjusting to the presence of other voices. The mansion that had seemed so grand and imposing during the day took on a different character in the evening light. Rooms that had been showcases becoming spaces where a family might actually live. The next morning brought their first real glimpse of the world beyond the ranch house walls. Emma, whose curiosity could not be contained by mere instructions to stay close, had discovered a loose board in the garden fence and wriggled through to explore the vast playground that surrounded them. She returned an hour later with grass stains on her dress, mud on her boots, and a detailed report on everything she had seen: the horses in the near pasture, 7, the barn cats, at least 5, possibly more, and the most interesting discovery of all, fresh cattle tracks that were too small and too numerous to belong to the Silver Spur herd. They were different, she explained to Josie with the authority of someone who had become an expert tracker in the space of a single morning. Smaller hooves, and they were going the wrong way. All the other cows go toward the water, but these ones were going toward the fence. Josie, who had been organizing the contents of their shared chest of drawers with mathematical precision, looked up with interest. "How many tracks?" she asked, because numbers always mattered to Josie. "Lots," Emma said, which was not the precise answer her sister preferred, but was apparently the best she could offer. Cora listened to this exchange while preparing breakfast, her maternal instincts immediately alert to the implications of Emma's discovery. She had grown up around working ranches, and she knew that cattle moving in unusual patterns often meant trouble. When Monty appeared for his morning coffee, she mentioned Emma's observations as casually as she could manage. The effect was immediate and telling. Monty's expression darkened, and his hands tightened around his coffee cup with the controlled tension of a man who recognized a familiar threat. "Did she see any riders with these cattle?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "She didn't mention." "Any," Cora replied, pouring eggs into the hot skillet with steady hands, despite the sudden tension in the room. "Should I be concerned?" For a moment, Monty seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if deciding how much reality a woman with children should be asked to bear. Finally, he set down his cup and looked directly at her, and she saw in his eyes the burden of a man who had been fighting battles alone for too long. "There's a man named Vernon Pike who owns the spread to the east," he said quietly. "He's been expanding his operations recently, taking cattle that might not strictly belong to him, moving boundary markers that have stood for 20 years. The territorial government doesn't much care about range disputes, especially when one of the parties involved has connections in Helena." Cora absorbed this information while scrambling eggs that suddenly seemed far less important than they had moments before. "And you think he might be taking your cattle?" "I think Vernon Pike wants the Silver Spur," Monty said bluntly. "He's been buying up smaller ranches all through the valley, forcing people out through debt or intimidation or simple attrition. My land sits right in the middle of what he considers his natural territory." Emma, who had been listening with the intense concentration of a child who understood that adult conversations sometimes contain vital information, piped up from her place at the table. "Is he a bad man?" Monty looked at her for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer honestly without frightening her. "He's a man who wants things that don't belong to him," he said finally, "and sometimes that makes people do things." they shouldn't do. This was more complexity than Emma had been prepared for, and she turned to Josie for guidance. Josie, who possessed the kind of practical wisdom that often accompanies a gift for numbers, considered the problem with her usual methodical approach. How many cattle does he have to take before it becomes a big problem? She asked, because Josie believed that every problem could be solved if you understood the mathematics involved. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Monty found himself smiling at the question. That, he said, is exactly the right thing to ask. And I'm afraid the answer is not very many. The implications of this conversation followed them through the rest of the morning as Cora established routines that would allow her to manage both her domestic responsibilities and her growing awareness that the Silver Spur Ranch was not the safe haven she had hoped to find. The twins, with the adaptability of children who had learned to make themselves at home quickly, settled into the rhythm of ranch life with an ease that both impressed and worried their mother. By afternoon, the kitchen had been transformed from a sterile workspace into something that resembled the heart of a home. Cora's recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages weighted down with the smooth riverstone Emma had found near the garden gate. The scents of baking bread and simmering soup had begun to permeate the air, replacing the faint mustiness of a room too long unused. Even the light seemed different, warmer somehow, as if the very act of cooking with love had changed the way the sun fell through the windows. But beneath the domestic tranquility, Cora could feel the weight of larger forces at work. She had come to the Silver Spur seeking shelter for herself and her daughters, a place where they could rebuild their lives after the devastating loss of her husband. What she had found instead was a man as isolated as she was desperate, a ranch as grand as it was lonely, and a conflict that threatened to sweep away whatever fragile security they might manage to build together. As evening settled over the ranch, and she tucked her daughters into their narrow beds above the pantry, Cora allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been trying to ignore all day. She was no longer just a cook fulfilling a 2-week contract. She was a woman with children who had stepped into the middle of someone else's war, and the choices she made in the coming days would determine not just her own future, but the safety and security of the 2 small girls who trusted her to protect them from a world that had already taken too much away. The discovery happened quite by accident, the way the most important revelations often do. Josie had been exploring the house during the quiet hour after lunch, when children are supposed to rest but rarely do, her natural curiosity drawing her to the partially open door of Monty's study. What she found there would have overwhelmed most adults, but to a 6-year-old with an unusual gift for numbers, it presented itself as the most fascinating puzzle she had ever encountered. The ledger books lay scattered across Monty's massive oak desk like fallen soldiers, their pages filled with columns of figures that seemed to dance and weave without any discernible pattern. Bills of sale mixed with expense reports, cattle counts jumbled together with feed costs, and everywhere the evidence of a brilliant man who had built an empire, but had never learned to organize the paperwork that proved it. Josie stood in the doorway for several minutes, her dark eyes moving systematically across the chaos with the calculating gaze of a general surveying a battlefield. She could see immediately that the numbers wanted to be organized, that they were crying out for someone to arrange them in ways that would reveal their secrets and make their stories clear. It was the kind of mathematical disorder that made her fingers itch to begin sorting and organizing and creating the beautiful symmetry that numbers possessed when they were properly understood. She found Monty an hour later, sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee and the weary expression of a man carrying too many worries alone. "Mr. High," she said politely, her hands clasped behind her back in the way her mother had taught her was proper when addressing adults. "I think your numbers are very sad." Monty looked down at the serious little girl standing before him, her face grave with the weight of her discovery. "My numbers are sad? They're all mixed up and lonely," Josie explained with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining mathematical concepts to people who didn't quite understand them. "They want to be with their families, but they're scattered all around like they got lost in a storm." Despite his exhaustion, Monty found himself genuinely curious about this child's perspective. "And what do you think should be done about these sad numbers?" Josie brightened immediately, recognizing the tone of an adult who was actually interested in what she had to say. "They need to be organized," she said with the confidence of someone stating the obvious. "All the cattle numbers should live together, and all the money numbers should have their own neighborhood, and the feed numbers should be arranged by months so you can see patterns." "Patterns?" Monty repeated, his interest now fully engaged. "Everything has patterns," Josie explained earnestly. "Mama's recipes have patterns: so much flour, so much sugar, always in the same proportions, or the bread won't rise properly. Emma's exploring has patterns too. She always goes to the highest place first, then works her way down. Your ranch probably has patterns, but you can't see them because your numbers are too confused." The simple wisdom of this observation struck Monty with unexpected force. He had always been good with figures when they related to immediate decisions: buying cattle, negotiating prices, calculating profits. But the broader patterns that might reveal inefficiencies or opportunities had escaped him simply because he had never organized his records in a way that made such patterns visible. "Would you like to help me organize these numbers?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Josie's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Oh, yes," she breathed. "Could I really?" That afternoon, Cora found them in the study together. Josie perched on a wooden crate so she could reach the desk properly, her small hands moving among the papers with the confidence of someone who had finally found her true calling. Monty sat beside her, watching in amazement as she created order from chaos with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost magical. "She's been working for 2 hours," Monty told Cora quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "She's found mistakes in my arithmetic that go back 3 years, and she's discovered cattle purchases I'd completely forgotten about. I think she might understand my business better than I do." Cora watched her daughter work, pride and concern warring in her expression. Josie had always been different, had always seen patterns and relationships that escaped other people, but this was the first time an adult had recognized her gift as something valuable rather than merely peculiar. "She's always been good with numbers," Cora said softly. "Her father used to say she could count the stars in the sky and tell you if any were missing." Over the following days, the transformation in both the study and the ranch's operations became increasingly apparent. Josie's organizational system revealed that the Silver Spur was actually more profitable than Monty had realized, but also more vulnerable. She discovered that feed costs had been climbing steadily for months without his noticing, that several bills had been paid twice while others had been overlooked entirely, and most importantly, that the pattern of missing cattle was more extensive and more systematic than random rustling would explain. "Look," she said one morning, spreading 3 months' worth of cattle counts across the desk like a card dealer revealing a winning hand. "Every time you count the cattle in the south pasture, there are fewer than there should be. But it's not the same number fewer each time. It's getting worse." Monty studied the figures she had so carefully arranged, seeing for the first time the mathematical proof of what his instincts had been telling him for weeks. Pike wasn't just taking the occasional stray or settling old grievances. He was systematically stealing cattle in increasing numbers, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. "How many total?" Monty asked, though he dreaded the answer. Josie consulted the small notebook where she had been tracking her calculations. 63 head over 3 months, she said matter-of-factly. "At current market prices, that's about $1,500. The figure hit Monty like a physical blow. $1,500 was more than many ranchers made in a year, and it represented a direct assault on his ability to maintain the Silver Spur's operations. But more than the money, it was proof that Pike was growing bolder, more confident in his ability to steal with impunity. Meanwhile, Emma had been conducting her own form of research, though her methods were considerably less mathematical than her sister's. Each morning, as soon as her chores were finished, she would slip away to explore different sections of the ranch, returning with detailed reports on everything she had seen and experienced. Unlike Josie, who saw the world in terms of numbers and patterns, Emma understood it through stories and adventures, connections and relationships. She knew which horses were friendliest and which were skittish, which barn cats had new litters and where they were hidden, which ranch hands told the best stories and which ones sang while they worked. She had memorized the migration patterns of the geese overhead, the daily routines of the chickens, and the social hierarchy of the ranch dogs. Most importantly, she had begun to understand the rhythms and relationships that made the Silver Spur more than just a business that made it a community. Mr. Morrison likes to whistle Buffalo Gals when he thinks nobody's listening, she reported to her mother one evening. And Jimmy Martinez draws pictures of horses in the dirt when he's waiting for the cattle to move. They're very good pictures. These observations might have seemed insignificant to an adult, but Cora recognized them as evidence of her daughter's remarkable ability to see the human connections that held complex organizations together. Emma was mapping the Silver Spur's social geography with the same precision that Josie was bringing to its financial structure. The combination of their efforts began to transform not just the ranch's record-keeping, but the way Monty understood his own operation. For years, he had seen the Silver Spur primarily as a business enterprise, a collection of assets and liabilities that needed to be managed for maximum profit. But watching it through the eyes of two children who saw patterns in numbers and stories in daily routines, he began to understand it as something far more complex and valuable. It was during this period of discovery and organization that the first direct confrontation with Pike occurred. Monty was riding the south fence line with Chuck Morrison, investigating reports of more missing cattle, when they encountered 3 riders driving a small herd toward the property boundary. The men wore no identifying marks, but their casual efficiency suggested they were experienced at this particular type of work. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Monty called out, his voice carrying the careful courtesy that often preceded violence on the frontier. "Those look like Silver Spur cattle you're moving." The lead rider, a lean man with the hard eyes of someone who had crossed too many moral boundaries to retreat, touched his hat brim in a mockery of respect. "Must be mistaken, friend. These here are strays we found wandering loose. Figured we'd drive them back where they belong." "And where might that be?" Chuck asked, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Pike spread," the man replied with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Where they've always belonged." The mathematical precision of Josie's cattle counts had given Monty the confidence to challenge such claims directly. "Interesting," he said mildly, "because my records show those particular animals were born on this ranch and have never been anywhere else." For a moment, the situation balanced on the edge of gunplay. 3 men facing 2 in a confrontation that could easily escalate beyond words. But the rustlers were professionals who understood that outright violence would bring territorial marshals and federal attention that Pike could not afford. After a tense pause, they released the cattle and rode away, but not before the lead man delivered a message that chilled Monty's blood. "Mr. Pike sends his regards," the rustler said conversationally. "Says to tell you he's looking forward to meeting your new cook and her little girls. Heard they're real charming." The threat was unmistakable, and it changed everything. What had been a business dispute between neighboring ranchers had become something far more personal and dangerous. As Monty watched the riders disappear over the ridge, he realized that his decision to hire Cora and her daughters had made them targets in a conflict they had never chosen to join. That evening, as he sat in his study, surrounded by Josie's carefully organized ledgers and Emma's cheerful drawings of ranch life, Monty faced the most difficult decision of his adult life. He could send them away, back to the uncertain safety of town and an unknown future, or he could find a way to protect them while continuing to fight for the ranch that had been his life's work. The choice, he realized, had already been made. Somewhere in the space between Josie's mathematical revelations and Emma's innocent adventures, between Cora's warm meals and the gradual transformation of his house into a home, the Silver Spur had become more than just his property. It had become their sanctuary, and he would defend it accordingly. Emma's hand-drawn map would have been dismissed by most adults as the charming but inaccurate work of a child's imagination, sketched on brown wrapping paper with a stubby pencil. It showed the Silver Spur Ranch, as Emma understood it, not as a collection of property lines and legal boundaries, but as a living landscape filled with secret places and hidden stories. What made the map remarkable was not its artistic merit, but its uncanny accuracy in capturing details that more sophisticated surveys had somehow missed. She had been working on it for 3 days, adding new discoveries each time she returned from her explorations. The main house sat in the center like a castle, surrounded by carefully drawn barns and corrals that bore a surprising resemblance to their actual counterparts. Winding paths connected various buildings, marked with Emma's personal notations. Good place for hide and seek, where the orange cat lives, Mr. Morrison's favorite sitting rock. But it was the area beyond the formal ranch buildings that revealed Emma's true gift for observation. She had mapped every stream and water source she could find, noting which ones ran year-round and which were seasonal. Her crude drawings included elevation changes that would have impressed a surveyor, and most importantly, they showed a small building in a grove of cottonwoods that appeared on no official ranch map. "What's this?" Cora asked, pointing to the carefully detailed structure that Emma had drawn near the northwest corner of her map. "The old spring house," Emma said matter-of-factly, as if everyone should know about such things. "It's where the sweetest water comes from. The roof is mostly fallen in, but the spring still works perfectly. I tested it." Monty, who had been reviewing correspondence at the kitchen table, looked up sharply. "Spring house? Emma, are you certain about this?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Oh, yes. It's built right over a spring that bubbles up from deep underground. The water is so cold it makes your teeth hurt, and it tastes like what water is supposed to taste like before people do things to it." The implications of this discovery were staggering. Water rights in Montana Territory were often more valuable than the land itself, and a reliable spring could mean the difference between prosperity and failure for any ranching operation. More immediately, it could provide the Silver Spur with independence from the seasonal streams that Pike had been subtly trying to control through his expanding land acquisitions. "Can you show me this place?" Monty asked, his voice carefully controlled to hide his excitement. "Of course," Emma replied cheerfully, "but you'll have to walk. It's too far back in the trees for horses, and the path is very twisty." The expedition that afternoon included Monty, Emma, and Chuck Morrison, who had been skeptical of the whole enterprise, until Emma led them directly to a grove of ancient cottonwoods that he had ridden past 100 times without ever investigating. Hidden among the trees, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, stood the ruins of a stone spring house that had clearly been built decades earlier. The structure itself was in poor condition, its wooden roof mostly collapsed, and its stone walls partially crumbled. But the spring that fed it was everything Emma had claimed, a clear, cold stream that bubbled up from deep underground and flowed away through a series of natural channels that eventually joined the main creek. System miles downstream. "I'll be damned," Chuck muttered, kneeling beside the spring and cupping the cold water in his weathered hands. This explains why this section of the ranch always stayed green, even in dry years. There's enough flow here to support twice as many cattle as we're currently running in this area. Monty examined the springhouse ruins with a calculating eye of a man who understood infrastructure. The building could be rebuilt easily enough, and with proper management, the spring could provide water for expanded operations that would make the Silver Spur largely independent of external water sources. More importantly, it gave him a significant advantage in any conflict with Pike, who had been assuming that water scarcity would eventually force smaller ranchers to sell or relocate. "How did you find this place?" he asked Emma, genuinely curious about her methods. Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I follow the green," she said finally. "When everything else gets brown and dry, there are still places that stay green. It usually means water, and water usually means interesting things." The simple logic of this approach impressed both men, who had been trained to think about land management in terms of official surveys and documented resources. Emma's intuitive understanding of natural systems had led her to a discovery that could reshape the ranch's entire strategic position. Back at the house, Josie received the news of the spring house with the same analytical enthusiasm she brought to all new information. Within an hour, she had calculated the potential value of the additional water rights, estimated the cost of rebuilding the spring house structure, and projected the increased cattle capacity that reliable water would support. "It's like finding money buried in the ground," she announced, her pencil moving rapidly across a fresh sheet of paper. "The spring makes this section of the ranch worth about 40% more than anyone thought." But even as the family celebrated Emma's discovery, larger forces were moving against them. Vernon Pike had not built his empire by accepting setbacks passively, and the rustler's encounter with Monty had convinced him that a more aggressive approach would be necessary to secure the Silver Spur properties. The territorial tax assessor arrived on a Thursday morning, a thin, nervous man named Cornelius Whitaker, who claimed to be conducting routine property evaluations for the territorial government. But his questions were far too specific, and his interest in particular aspects of the ranch far too focused for a routine assessment. He seemed especially interested in water sources, mineral rights, and the exact boundaries of the Silver Spur holdings. Cora, who had developed a keen sense for detecting dishonesty during her years managing a Rivertown bakery, watched the assessor with growing suspicion. There was something in his manner, the way he avoided direct eye contact, the careful precision of his note-taking, the subtle nervousness that suggested a man doing work he knew to be questionable, that set her maternal instincts on high alert. "He's not here to help us," she told Monty that evening after Whitaker had retired to the guest room for the night. "I've seen that look before, on men who came to tell river families their boats were being repossessed or their docking rights revoked. He's here to find reasons to take something away from you." Monty had reached the same conclusion through different reasoning. Whitaker's questions had focused heavily on improvements and developments that would increase the ranch's assessed value, while ignoring factors that might justify lower valuations. The man was clearly working toward a predetermined conclusion rather than conducting an honest evaluation. "Pike's behind this," Monty said grimly. "If he can't steal the ranch directly, he'll try to tax me out of it, raise the assessment high enough, and I won't be able to afford the territorial taxes." "How high could they raise them?" Cora asked. No, she dreaded the answer. "High enough to force a sale," Monty replied. "Pike has connections in Helena. If he wants this land badly enough, he can probably arrange for tax bills that would bankrupt most operations." The threat crystallized over the next 2 days, as Whitaker completed his assessment with the thorough efficiency of a man who had performed similar services before. His final evaluation placed the Silver Spur's value at nearly 3 times the previous assessment, a figure that would result in tax obligations far beyond the ranch's ability to pay. "I'm afraid there's been significant appreciation in land values throughout the territory," Whitaker explained with the apologetic tone of someone delivering bad news he had no power to change. "The territorial government needs revenue for infrastructure development, and property taxes must reflect current market realities." The mathematics were simple and devastating, even with the improved efficiency that Josie's organization had brought to the ranch operations. The new tax burden would exceed the Silver Spur's annual profits by a substantial margin. Without a dramatic increase in revenue or a significant reduction in expenses, Monty would be forced to sell within months. That evening, as the family gathered around the kitchen table for what had become their traditional after-dinner discussions, the weight of their situation settled over them like a physical presence. Emma, who usually chattered happily about her daily adventures, sat quietly beside her sister. Josie arranged her pencils with unusual precision, as if mathematical order could somehow solve problems that seemed to defy logical solutions. "There has to be something we can do," Cora said finally, her voice carrying the determination of a woman who had faced impossible circumstances before. "People don't just steal entire ranches in broad daylight. There have to be legal protections. Appeals process is something." "In theory, yes," Monty replied wearily. "In practice, Pike has enough influence in Helena to make sure those protections don't apply to him. The territorial government wants revenue, and they're not particular about how they get it." Josie looked up from her pencils, her young face serious with concentration. "What if we made more money?" she asked with a directness that characterized all her approaches to problem-solving. "What if we found a way to earn enough to pay the new taxes?" "We'd need to increase revenue by at least 60%, Monty explained gently. "That would mean selling more cattle than we currently own, or finding some other source of income that doesn't exist yet. But Emma, who had been listening with the intense focus she brought to all adult conversations, suddenly brightened. "What? About the spring house?" she asked excitedly. "What about all that wonderful water? Surely that must be worth something." A question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since Whitaker's arrival, Monty felt a glimmer of hope. Emma was right. The spring represented an untapped resource that could potentially generate revenue far beyond traditional cattle operations. Ice houses were becoming increasingly valuable as towns grew and demanded luxury goods. The spring, water itself might be marketed to hotels and restaurants. And with proper development, the spring house could anchor expanded agricultural operations that would dramatically increase the ranch's productivity. "You might be onto something," he said slowly, his mind already beginning to calculate possibilities. "We'd need to move fast, and we'd need to think bigger than anything we've tried before. But yes, there might be a way." As the family began to explore the implications of Emma's suggestion, the kitchen filled with the kind of electric energy that accompanies the birth of bold ideas. The spring house that Emma had discovered might not just be a hidden asset, it might be the key to saving everything they had begun to build together. Outside, the Montana evening settled over the ranch with the peaceful quiet of a world that seemed stable and secure. But inside the warm circle of lamplight that surrounded the kitchen table, 4 people who had found each other through circumstance and desperation began to plan a campaign that would either secure their future or destroy it completely. The forged property survey arrived with Vernon Pike's morning correspondence, delivered by a rider who waited just long enough to ensure the envelope reached its intended recipient before spurring his horse back toward the territorial capital. Pike unfolded the document with the satisfied expression of a man whose careful investments in corruption were finally yielding profitable returns. The survey, bearing the official seal of the Territorial Land Office, showed clear evidence of boundary errors in the original Silver Spur property description. According to the new documentation, Monty's ranch had been claiming water rights that legally belonged to the Pike Holdings, an oversight that would need to be corrected immediately to avoid federal intervention. The mathematical precision of the fraud was impressive. The altered boundary lines had been calculated to transfer control of Emma's springhouse and several miles of prime water. Access to Pike's ownership. Pike studied the document with the appreciation of a craftsman admiring superior work. The forger had done an excellent job, creating paperwork that would stand up to casual inspection while serving Pike's immediate need to establish legal justification for seizing the Silver Spur's most valuable assets. Combined with the tax assessment that would bankrupt Monty within months, the fraudulent survey provided multiple avenues for acquiring the ranch through apparently legal means. Meanwhile, at the Silver Spur, the devastating impact of Whitaker's assessment was becoming clear. As Monty worked through the financial implications with Josie's help, the numbers were unforgiving in their simplicity. The new tax burden would consume every dollar of profit the ranch generated, leaving nothing for operating expenses, improvements, or the basic necessities of daily life. Even if we sold half the herd and reduced operations dramatically, we still couldn't meet these obligations, Monty explained to Cora as they reviewed Josie's careful calculations. Pike has engineered this perfectly. The taxes are high enough to force a sale, but not so high as to be obviously fraudulent. Cora listened with the focused attention of a woman who had learned to recognize existential threats during her years of financial uncertainty following her husband's death. She understood the mathematics of desperation, the way mounting obligations could transform a temporary setback into permanent ruin. But she also understood something that Monty's years of solitary struggle had not taught him: the power of community mobilization when people faced common threats. "What if we don't fight this alone?" she asked quietly, her fingers tracing patterns on the kitchen table as her mind worked through possibilities. "What if we make this everyone's problem instead of just ours?" The idea that began to take shape over the following days was audacious in its scope and unprecedented in its approach. Instead of accepting defeat or attempting to fight Pike's corruption through legal channels that he controlled, they would create a public event that would generate the revenue needed to survive. while exposing Pike's methods to community scrutiny. That even territorial politicians could not ignore that the harvest fair concept emerged from conversations. That included every member of the household, each contributing elements that reflected their unique perspectives and capabilities. Emma's springhouse would provide the foundation for ice cream production that could attract families from throughout the region. Josie's organizational skills would ensure that every aspect of the event was planned and executed with mathematical precision. Cora's reputation as a baker would draw people seeking quality goods they could not find elsewhere. And Monty's connections throughout the ranching community would provide the network needed to make the fair a regional attraction rather than a local curiosity. We'll need to raise at least $3,000 to cover the tax obligation and operating expenses, Josie calculated, her pencil moving rapidly across fresh paper. That means we need to sell enough goods and services to generate gross revenue of approximately $4,000, accounting for costs and materials. The figure seemed impossible until they began breaking it down into achievable components. Ice cream made from Emma's spring water could sell for premium prices to families eager for luxury treats. Cora's baking expanded to include specialties that showcased her Rivertown heritage, could attract buyers from distant communities. Local crafts, entertainment, and agricultural displays could transform the event into a celebration that people would travel significant distances to attend. It's not just about the money, Cora realized as the plan developed. If we can show the entire region what Pike is trying to do, if we can make this a public issue instead of a private dispute, he'll have a much harder time completing his takeover. The logistical challenges were staggering. They would need to rebuild the springhouse to support ice production, organize vendors and entertainment, coordinate with suppliers throughout the territory, and manage an event that could potentially draw hundreds of participants. All of this would need to be accomplished within weeks, while maintaining normal ranch operations and preparing for Pike's inevitable counterattacks. But as word of the harvest fair began to spread through the informal networks that connected ranching families across Montana territory, the response exceeded their most optimistic projections. People who had never heard of the Silver Spur offered to contribute goods, services, and labor to an event that represented something larger than commerce. It represented resistance to the kind of corruption that threatened every independent operation in the region. Chuck Morrison emerged as an unexpected organizational leader, his years of managing ranch hands translating perfectly to coordinating volunteer labor and logistics. Half the ranchers in 3 counties have been waiting for someone to take a stand against Pike, he told Monty one evening as they reviewed work assignments. This fair gives them a way to fight back without putting their own operations at risk. Volunteers who began arriving at the Silver Spur brought skills and resources that transformed the ambitious concept into practical reality. Carpenters appeared to rebuild the springhouse with materials donated by lumber operations that had their own grievances against Pike's business practices. Women from neighboring ranches arrived with fabric, decorating supplies, and organizational expertise that turned chaotic enthusiasm into focused preparation. Children helped with simple tasks while absorbing lessons about community cooperation that would shape their understanding of social responsibility for years to come. Emma threw herself into the springhouse reconstruction with the passionate enthusiasm of someone seeing her greatest discovery transformed into something wonderful. She appointed herself chief water quality inspector, testing the spring daily to ensure it maintained the perfect temperature and clarity that would make their ice cream special. Her detailed reports included observations about optimal collection times, seasonal variations in flow rate, and the precise locations where the water maintained its coldest temperature. The spring runs strongest in the early morning, she announced to the construction crew with the authority of an expert. And if you build the collection basin 18 inches to the left of where you have it now, the water will be 3 degrees colder. The workers, initially skeptical of taking engineering advice from a 6-year-old, soon learned that Emma's intuitive understanding of water systems was remarkably accurate. Her suggestions consistently improved the efficiency and functionality of their construction, earning her a level of respect that delighted her practical soul. Meanwhile, Josie had established herself as the fair's chief financial officer, tracking every expense and projecting revenue with a methodical precision that had transformed Monty's chaotic record-keeping. Her ledgers became the definitive source for all planning decisions, her calculations the foundation for every vendor agreement and supply purchase. "We're currently projected to exceed our revenue target by 12%, she reported during one of their evening planning sessions. "But only if the weather remains favorable and attendance meets our conservative estimates." The mathematical complexity of coordinating multiple revenue streams, variable costs, and uncertain attendance would have challenged experienced event planners. But Josie approached it with a systematic methodology that made complex problems manageable, creating contingency plans for various scenarios and establishing benchmarks that would allow real-time adjustments to pricing and operations. As the fair preparations intensified, Pike's responses became increasingly desperate and obvious. Rumors began circulating that the Silver Spur was financially unstable, that the Harvest Fair was a last-ditch attempt to avoid bankruptcy, that families attending the event risked being caught up in legal proceedings when Monty's creditors foreclosed on the property. Anonymous letters appeared in several regional newspapers, questioning the safety and legitimacy of the upcoming celebration. More directly, Pike began offering unusually generous terms to Silver Spur vendors and suppliers, attempting to undermine the fair by creating shortages of essential materials and services. Several key participants received visits from Pike's representatives, who suggested that continued cooperation with the Silver Spur might result in difficulties with their own business relationships throughout the territory. "He's getting scared," Monty observed with grim satisfaction as reports of Pike's interference continued to accumulate. If he thought he could simply wait for the tax deadline to force a sale, he wouldn't be working so hard to sabotage our preparations. But Pike's most effective attack came through official channels that were much harder to counter directly. The Territorial Marshal's office announced that it would be conducting a comprehensive review of all land titles and water rights in the region, beginning with properties that had recent disputes or unclear documentation. The Silver Spur was specifically mentioned as a ranch requiring immediate investigation due to irregularities in historical boundary surveys. The implications were clear and terrifying. Pike's forged property survey was about to become the basis for official government action that could strip away the springhouse and water rights that made the Harvest Fair economically viable. Without Emma's spring, they would lose both their competitive advantage and their practical ability to generate the revenue needed to survive Pike's tax assault. "How long do we have?" Cora asked, though she could see the answer in Monty's expression. "The Marshal plans to begin his investigation immediately after the fair," Monty replied. "If we're going to make this work, it has to be perfect. We'll have one chance to raise the money and expose Pike's corruption before he uses the territorial government to finish what he started." The kitchen fell silent as the full weight of their situation settled over them. They were no longer just planning a harvest fair. They were preparing for a battle that would determine not only their financial survival, but their ability to remain together as the family they had unexpectedly become. Outside, the October evening carried the crisp promise of winter, and the lights of the reconstructed springhouse glowed like a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. In just 2 weeks, the Silver Spur would either triumph through community support and collective determination, or it would fall to corruption that had been carefully designed to appear legal and inevitable. The choice, they realized, was no longer entirely in their hands. It now belonged to every person who would decide whether to attend a harvest fair that represented much more than entertainment. It represented the possibility that ordinary people could still resist the forces that sought to steal their dreams. Cora's Harvest Fair planning notes filled 3 notebooks with a kind of detailed preparation that would have impressed military logisticians. Written in her careful script, each page represented hours of calculation, negotiation, and creative problem-solving that transformed a desperate idea into a practical enterprise. The notebooks had become the operational Bible for an event that would either save the Silver Spur or mark its final chapter. The first notebook contained vendor agreements and supply contracts, each one negotiated with the careful attention to detail that Cora had learned during her years managing a river town. Bakery. She had secured commitments from craftsmen throughout the territory leatherworkers, who would demonstrate their skills while selling goods, wood carvers who would create custom pieces during the fair, seamstresses who would display quilts, and clothing that showcased the artistic traditions of frontier families. The second notebook focused on food preparation and logistics, detailing recipes that could be scaled up to feed hundreds of people while maintaining the quality that would justify premium prices. Cora had calculated ingredient requirements with mathematical precision that rivaled Josie's financial projections, accounting for variables like weather, attendance fluctuations, and the challenge of cooking with equipment that ranged from professional grade to improvised field kitchens. The third notebook contained what Cora privately considered the most important information, the human connections that would make the fair a community celebration rather than just a commercial venture. Names and addresses of families throughout the region, notes about their interests and circumstances, reminders about children's names and special occasions that would allow personal touches in correspondence and conversation. Mrs. Henderson from Bozeman is bringing her prize-winning preserves, Cora reported during one of their evening planning sessions, consulting her notes with the precision of a general reviewing troop positions. The Martinez family is organizing traditional Mexican dancing demonstrations, and the Larson boys are planning a horseshoe tournament that should draw competitors from at least 4 counties. Each addition to the program represented not just entertainment value, but strategic positioning in the larger conflict with Pike. Every family that committed to participating became a stakeholder in the Silver Spur's survival, creating a network of community support that extended far beyond the ranch's property boundaries. Josie had embraced her role as chief financial officer with the serious enthusiasm of someone finally able to apply her mathematical gifts to problems that mattered. Her ledgers tracked every aspect of the fair's economics with accounting precision that would have impressed territorial bank examiners. Revenue projections, expense budgets, inventory management, and profit calculations filled page after page of careful notations. We'll need to sell approximately 240 portions of ice cream at 15 cents each to cover the Springhouse reconstruction costs, she announced, consulting her latest calculations. But if we can maintain premium pricing for specialty flavors, we can reduce the break-even point to 180 portions. The mathematics of large-scale event planning fascinated Josie in ways that traditional childhood activities never had. She approached vendor commissions, material costs, and attendance projections with the same systematic methodology she had brought to organizing Monty's chaotic business records, creating order from complexity through careful analysis and logical organization. But it was Emma's contribution that transformed the practical planning into something approaching magic. Her Springhouse had become the centerpiece of an operation that combined traditional ice cream production with innovative techniques that maximized both quality and efficiency. Working with the volunteer construction crews she had helped design collection and cooling systems that maintained optimal water temperature throughout the day. If we harvest ice in the early morning when the air is coldest and store it in the root cellar with layers of sawdust, we can keep it frozen until afternoon, Emma explained to amazed adults who were still adjusting to receiving engineering advice from a 6-year-old. And if we add rock salt to the freezing mixture, we can make ice cream faster and smoother. Her intuitive understanding of thermodynamics and preservation techniques had emerged through pure observation and experimentation. She tested different freezing methods, monitored temperature variations throughout the day, and developed quality control procedures that ensured consistent results regardless of weather conditions or production volume. The Springhouse itself had been transformed from a ruined structure into a showcase of frontier engineering. The rebuilt stone walls enclosed modern cooling systems that utilized both the natural spring and artificial ice production. Wooden platforms provided working surfaces that kept ingredients at optimal temperatures, while a system of channels and basins moved water through the production area with elegant efficiency. As word of the Harvest Fair spread throughout the territory, the response exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Letters arrived daily from families planning to attend, many of them traveling significant distances to participate in what had become a regional celebration. Hotel owners in Bozeman reported unprecedented advance reservations from people planning extended stays to attend the Silver Spur event. But the growing Enthusiasm also attracted Pike's attention in ways that created new challenges and dangers. His initial attempts at subtle sabotage, spreading rumors about financial instability and safety concerns, had been largely unsuccessful. The community response had been too positive, the preparation too obviously professional for such tactics. To gain traction, Pike's more direct interventions proved equally ineffective. His offers to purchase vendor contracts at premium prices were rejected by suppliers who understood the larger implications of the conflict. His attempts to create material shortages were circumvented by the network of cooperative relationships that Cora had built throughout the region. His suggestions that participation in the fair might result in business difficulties were met with responses that made clear he had seriously underestimated the community's commitment to the Silver Spur's success. "People are starting to see this as bigger than just our ranch," Monty observed as he reviewed the latest correspondence. "They're treating it as a fight against the kind of corruption that threatens everyone." The political dimension of the Harvest Fair had evolved beyond their mere original intentions. What had begun as a desperate attempt to raise money had become a public referendum on Pike's methods and influence. Territorial newspapers were covering the story as a test case for whether independent ranchers could resist the consolidation efforts that were transforming the region's economic landscape. Got the pressure of organizing such an ambitious event while maintaining normal ranch operations created stress that tested everyone's endurance and patience. Cora found herself working 18-hour days, coordinating supplies and volunteers while managing her regular cooking responsibilities. Monty split his time between fair preparation and the increased vigilance required to protect against Pike's escalating harassment of Silver Spur operations. Even the twins felt the weight of adult expectations and responsibilities. Josie's financial calculations had become essential to daily decision-making, creating pressure for a 6-year-old who was still learning to manage the emotional complexity of adult praise and dependence. Emma's Springhouse expertise made her a key consultant for construction and production decisions, forcing her to balance childhood spontaneity with the serious business of ensuring technical success. The romantic tension between Monty and Cora intensified under the pressure of shared crisis and common purpose. Working together toward goals that would determine their mutual future created intimacy that neither had anticipated when their relationship began as a simple employment arrangement. But the uncertainty of their situation made it impossible to explore deeper feelings that might become irrelevant if the fair failed and the family was forced to separate. "Whatever happens," Cora said one evening as they reviewed the final preparation lists, "I want you to know that these weeks have been the happiest I've known since my husband died. Not because of the circumstances, but because of what we've built together." Monty looked across the kitchen table at the woman who had transformed his house into a home and his solitary existence into something resembling a real life. "Whatever happens," he replied, "I'll never regret the day you stepped off that stagecoach." The moment carried the weight of words they were not yet ready to speak, feelings that circumstances had not yet allowed them to explore fully. But it also carried the promise that their connection had grown beyond convenience or necessity into something that would endure, regardless of the external forces threatening to tear it apart. Outside, the October sky showed the first signs of a weather that could make or break their carefully planned event. Storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising the kind of sudden climate changes that could transform a successful fair into a muddy disaster. But inside the warm kitchen, where their planning had created the foundation for community resistance, 4 people who had found each other through desperation continued to work toward a future that would either vindicate their faith in each other or destroy everything they had learned to value. The Harvest Fair was now just days away, and with it would come the test of whether love, community, and determination could triumph over corruption, greed, and the raw power that Pike represented. The Silver Spur Ranch had become more than property. It had become a symbol. And symbols, they were about to learn, carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the people who created them. The hidden family Bible had traveled in Cora's carpetbag for over a year, wrapped carefully in her late husband's shirt and tucked beneath practical items she might need to access quickly. She had not opened it since the day she packed their belongings and left the river town where Thomas had died, unable to bear the memories contained within its familiar pages. But on the evening before the harvest fair, as she searched for her grandmother's recipe for celebration cake, her fingers encountered the worn leather binding, and she found herself unwrapping the sacred text that contained the most precious artifacts of her married life. The Bible itself was a substantial volume, bound in brown leather that showed the gentle wear of daily use rather than neglect. Thomas had read from it every morning and evening, his deep voice transforming familiar passages into personal conversations with the divine. Between its pages, Cora had pressed flowers from their wedding bouquet, leaves from the oak tree, where he had proposed, and small mementos from the years when they had believed their future stretched endlessly ahead of them. But it was the letter that stopped her, breath completely an envelope she had never seen before, tucked between the pages. Of Psalms and addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting to Mrs. Montgomery Hawley, Silver Spur Ranch, Montana Territory. The letter was sealed but never sent, dated just 3 weeks before the river accident that had claimed her husband's life and changed the trajectory of her world forever. With trembling fingers, Cora broke the seal and unfolded pages that revealed a connection between her past and present that seemed too remarkable to be mere coincidence. Thomas had written to someone named Montgomery Hall, describing his plans to bring his family to Montana Territory and seeking information about opportunities in the cattle business. The letter contained detailed questions about land availability, working conditions, and the potential for a baker and his family to establish themselves in the expanding frontier economy. But it was the personal portion of the letter that transformed everything Cora thought she understood about her current situation. Thomas wrote of his friendship with Jonathan Hall, Montgomery's father, whom he had known during his brief military service in the Colorado Territory. The two men had served together during the final campaigns against hostile tribes, and Jonathan had saved Thomas's life during an ambush that left the younger man with scars he would carry forever. "Your father was the finest man I ever knew," Thomas had written. He spoke often of his son Montgomery and the ranch he was building in Montana. "When my medical discharge came through, Jonathan made me promise to look him up if I ever found myself in your territory. He said the Hales took care of their friends, and that Montana needed good people who understood the value of hard work and honest dealing." The letter went on to describe Thomas's plan to move his family west after completing his commitment to the river bakery, his hope that Montana would provide opportunities for his daughters to grow up in country where their horizons would not be limited by the narrow expectations of river towns. He had written of Cora's skills as a baker and businesswoman, of Josie's remarkable gift with numbers, of Emma's adventurous spirit and intuitive understanding of natural systems. "I know it's presumptuous to write to a stranger based on an old friendship between our fathers," the letter concluded, "but Jonathan spoke of you with such pride and affection that I feel I know something of your character, if there's room in your operation for a family that understands hard work and values loyalty. We would be honored to contribute to the enterprise your father began." Cora sat in the kitchen's lamplight, reading and rereading words that revealed the profound connections underlying what she had assumed to be random circumstance. Her presence at the Silver Spur was not the desperate accident she had believed, but the fulfillment of plans that Thomas had been making before his death. The advertisement she had answered had not been placed for a stranger, but for the son of a man who had died trying to help others during a smallpox epidemic that Thomas had described in detail. The implications were staggering and deeply moving. Thomas had been planning to bring his family to the Silver Spur Ranch, to reunite with the son of a man who had saved his life and shaped his understanding of honor and sacrifice. His death had delayed, but not prevented that reunion, and Cora's desperate response to Monty's advertisement had completed a journey that Thomas had begun but not lived to finish. She found Monty in his study, reviewing final preparations for the harvest fair with the focused concentration of a general preparing for battle. When she placed the letter in his hands without explanation, she watched his expression change from curiosity to amazement to something approaching wonder as he absorbed the contents. "Thomas Whitfield," he said quietly, testing the name against memory. "My father mentioned him often during his final years. He said Thomas was the bravest man he'd ever known, someone who would risk everything to protect others. "The river accident," Cora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas died trying to save a family whose boat had capsized in a spring flood. He managed to get the children to safety, but the current took him before he could swim clear." Monty looked up from the letter, seeing Cora with new eyes as the pieces of a larger pattern fell into place. "So even at the end, he was still saving people." "It's what he did," Cora replied simply. "It's who he was." The discovery created a profound shift in how they understood their relationship and their current crisis. What had seemed like a business arrangement complicated by growing affection was revealed as something approaching destiny, the completion of connections that had been forged years before through sacrifice and saved lives. Their fight to preserve the silver spur was not just about protecting their own interests, but about honoring the memory of men who had built something worth defending. "There's more," Cora said softly, producing a small photograph that had been tucked inside the letter's envelope. The image showed two young men in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, with the easy camaraderie of soldiers who had faced danger together. One of them was clearly Thomas, younger and without the scars that would mark his later years. The other bore an unmistakable resemblance to Monty, though his eyes held the optimism of someone who had not yet learned that good intentions were not always enough to protect the people you loved. "That's my father," Monty said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't seen this photograph before." "Thomas kept it with our most precious things," Cora explained. "He used to tell the girls stories about their father's friend who built a castle on the prairie for families who needed safe places to grow and prosper." The photograph represented more than memory. It represented the continuity of values and relationships that Pike's corruption threatened to destroy. Jonathan Hawley had died, trying to help families during a smallpox epidemic, continuing his military commitment to protecting others, even in civilian life. Thomas Whitfield had died saving strangers from a river flood, demonstrating the same selfless courage that had earned Jonathan's respect years earlier. Now their children Monty and Cora, Josie and Emma, faced their own test of whether they would continue that legacy of sacrifice and service, or whether Pike's methods would triumph over the principles that had guided their fathers. "He would have loved this place," Cora said, looking around the kitchen that had become the heart of their improvised family. "He would have loved watching the girls grow up with space to explore and learn. He would have been proud to work beside you to build something that mattered." "And my father would have been proud to call Thomas's family his own," Monty replied. "He always said that the measure of a man was what he was willing to sacrifice for others." Both our fathers understood that principle. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, as they shared stories and memories that revealed the deep compatibility underlying their growing attraction. Thomas and Jonathan had been more than military comrades. They had been kindred spirits who shared a vision of what frontier life could become when people committed themselves to mutual support and common purpose. The fair isn't just about saving the ranch anymore, Monty realized as they watched the sun rise over the preparations that would soon be tested by hundreds of visitors. It's about proving that the values our fathers died for can still triumph over the corruption that threatens everything they believed in. Cora nodded, understanding that their personal stakes had been transformed into something much larger and more significant. Win or lose, we'll face it the way they would have together, with courage, and with faith that doing the right thing matters more than achieving the easy thing. As the household began stirring for what would be the most important day in the Holiday Silver Spur's history, Cora carefully returned the Bible and its precious contents to her carpetbag. But the knowledge it had revealed would remain with them as they faced the challenges ahead. The knowledge that their connection transcended circumstance, that their fight honored the memory of heroes, and that love could indeed overcome the forces of greed and corruption when it was backed by community support and unwavering determination. The harvest fair would test more than their ability to raise money or expose Pike's methods. It would test whether the next generation could live up to the example set by fathers who had understood that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. Montgomery Hale's father's pocket watch had been crafted in Philadelphia during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln its gold case engraved with a simple inscription, "Time and honor, wait for no man." Jonathan Hawley had carried it through military campaigns and civilian struggles, consulting its reliable mechanism during moments when important decisions could not be delayed or reconsidered. Now, as dawn broke over the Silver Spur Ranch on the morning of the harvest fair, Monty found himself holding the same timepiece and understanding for the first time the weight of responsibility his father had carried. The watch showed 5:30 in the morning, and already the ranch buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Volunteers who had arrived throughout the week moved through their assignments with the coordinated efficiency of a military operation, transforming the ordinary working ranch into something approaching a frontier festival. Banners stretched between fence posts, booths took shape in the main corral, and the rebuilt springhouse gleamed like a jewel in the center of what would soon become a celebration of community determination. Chuck Morrison had appointed himself chief coordinator for the volunteer labor force, his years of managing ranch operations translating perfectly to organizing dozens of families into productive work groups. "Ice cream station is ready for operation," he reported to Monty as they conducted their final inspection. "Mrs. Henderson's preserves booth is set up near the main gate, and the Martinez family has their dancing area prepared in the south pasture." Each detail represented countless hours of planning and preparation, but more importantly, each represented families who had committed themselves to the Silver Spur survival. The harvest fair had become larger than a commercial venture. It had become a statement about the kind of community these families wanted to build in Montana Territory. Cora emerged from the kitchen, where she had been working since 4 o'clock, her apron dusted with flour and her face showing the focused determination of someone managing a complex operation under enormous pressure. Behind her came a parade of ranch wives carrying pans, baskets, and serving dishes that would transform the morning's baking into the centerpiece of the day's food offerings. "Bread is ready, pies are cooling, and the celebration cake is in the final oven," she announced, consulting the checklist that had become her tactical manual. "We're prepared to feed 300 people, with reserves for higher attendance if the weather holds." The weather had become everyone's primary concern. As clouds gathered over the mountains with the threatening persistence of a late-season storm system, October in Montana could produce anything from gentle Indian summer warmth to devastating early blizzards, and the success of their outdoor event depended entirely on meteorological cooperation. They could not control or predict. Emma stood guard at her springhouse with the serious responsibility of someone whose discovery had become central to the day's success. She had been testing water temperature and ice quality since dawn, her careful monitoring ensuring that the ice cream production would meet the standards that could justify premium pricing and generate maximum revenue. "Water is perfect," she reported with the authority of an expert. Temperature steady at 38 degrees, flow rate optimal, and ice formation proceeding exactly as planned. Her technical expertise had impressed the adult volunteers who had initially been skeptical of taking direction from a 6-year-old. But Emma's intuitive understanding of the systems she had discovered proved more reliable than conventional wisdom, and her enthusiasm had become infectious among the workers who prepared the springhouse for its crucial role Josie had established. Her financial command post at a table on the front porch, her ledgers and calculation materials arranged with military precision. From this position, she could monitor all revenue-generating activities while maintaining the detailed records that would allow real-time adjustments to pricing and operations. "Current projections show we'll exceed minimum revenue requirements if attendance reaches 200 families," she announced, consulting her latest calculations. "But we need at least 150 families to cover basic costs and tax obligations." The mathematics of their situation remained unforgiving despite weeks of preparation. They had created the framework for success, but actual achievement would depend on factors beyond their control: weather, attendance, community response, and Pike's potential interference with an event he could not afford to allow succeeding. Pike's anticipated sabotage had been the subject of intense planning and preparation. Monty had positioned trusted ranch hands at strategic locations throughout the property, men who understood that their primary responsibility was security rather than entertainment. Chuck Morrison had coordinated with neighboring ranchers to ensure rapid response if Pike attempted direct interference with the fair's operations. "He'll make his move if he's going to," Monty predicted as he reviewed their defensive preparations. "Pike can't afford to let this succeed. If we raise the money and expose his corruption publicly, he loses both the ranch and his political influence." The territorial marshal's investigation of land titles and water rights provided Pike with official cover for almost any intervention he might choose to attempt. A convenient discovery of irregularities in Silver Spur documentation could shut down the fair immediately, while creating the appearance of legitimate law enforcement rather than corruption-driven harassment. But the community response had exceeded Pike's ability to control through intimidation or influence. Families continued arriving throughout the morning, their wagons and horses creating a bustling temporary settlement that stretched across the ranch's main areas. Many had traveled significant distances to attend, turning the harvest fair into a regional gathering that represented far more than local commercial enterprise. "Look at this," Emma called out excitedly, pointing toward the main road where a steady stream of visitors approached the ranch. "There are people coming from everywhere." The sight filled Monty with hope and terror in equal measure. Success was becoming possible in ways he had not dared to imagine, but the scale of the event also created vulnerabilities that Pike could exploit with devastating effectiveness. A single well-timed disruption could transform triumph into disaster, leaving the Silver Spur worse off than if they had never attempted resistance. As the morning progressed toward the official opening time, the final preparations took on the urgent character of a campaign approaching its decisive moment. Volunteers made last-minute adjustments to displays and equipment. Families found their assigned positions, and children began the process of transforming a working ranch into a place of celebration and community fellowship. Cora found herself standing beside Monty on the front porch, both of them surveying the transformation of their home into something neither had imagined when she first stepped off the stagecoach just weeks earlier. The formal distance of their initial employer-employee relationship had evolved into something approaching partnership, but the uncertainty of their situation had prevented them from exploring the deeper feelings that circumstances continued to intensify. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of emotions they had not yet found time to discuss fully, "I want you to know that I've never felt more at home anywhere than I have here." "Whatever happens," Monty replied, his hand finding hers with the natural gesture of someone no longer fighting the inevitable. "I know that my father would be proud of what we've built together." The moment carried the weight of feelings, too. Large for words, complicated by external pressures that made personal declarations seem both essential and impossibly risky. But it also carried the promise that their connection had grown beyond convenience or desperation into something that could survive whatever challenges the day might bring. The pocket watch in Monty's vest showed 9 o'clock as the first families began moving through the main gate, their arrival marking the official beginning of an event that would determine the future of everyone who had committed themselves to its success. Children raced ahead of their parents, drawn by the promise of ice cream and entertainment. Adults moved more carefully, their expressions showing the mix of anticipation and concern that accompanied community members who understood the larger implications of their attendance. Within an hour, the Silver Spur Ranch had been transformed into exactly the kind of celebration Cora had envisioned during those long planning sessions around the kitchen table. Families moved between booths and demonstrations. Children played games that showcased frontier skills, and the smell of baking and cooking created the atmosphere of abundance that made premium pricing seem reasonable rather than excessive. But beneath the surface festivities, everyone who understood the situation remained alert for signs of the interference that Pike's desperation made almost inevitable. The success of the morning made his sabotage more likely rather than less, and the scale of the event had created multiple opportunities for disruption that could devastate their carefully planned operations. As noon approached and revenue figures began exceeding their most optimistic projections, Monty consulted his father's watch one more time and realized that they were approaching the moment when Pike would either accept defeat or escalate to methods that had never been tested in their small corner of Montana Territory. The harvest fair had become more than a commercial enterprise. It had become a public test of whether corruption could triumph over community determination, and the outcome would resonate far beyond the boundaries of the Silver Spur Ranch. Success was undeniable and visible to everyone present. Josie's careful calculations showed revenue approaching their target figures with hours of fair activity remaining. Emma's ice cream operation had attracted lines of eager customers willing to pay premium prices for treats that justified their reputation. Cora's baking had sold out twice, requiring emergency production runs that showcased both her skills and the community's enthusiasm for quality goods. But success also made them increasingly vulnerable to the kind of sabotage that desperate men employ when legal methods fail to achieve desired outcomes. Chuck Morrison's security preparations had been designed to counter obvious interference, but Pike's reputation for cunning suggested that his response would be neither obvious nor easily anticipated. The first sign of trouble came not from Pike directly, but from territorial officials whose sudden appearance at the fair created the kind of administrative complications that could shut down any public gathering. A deputy marshal arrived with documents claiming authority to inspect all commercial activities for compliance with territorial licensing. Requirements that had never been mentioned or enforced at similar events throughout the region. "This is a public fair on private property," Monty explained to the deputy with careful politeness that masked his growing alarm. "We're not operating permanent commercial establishments that would require territorial licensing." "New regulations," the deputy replied with the bureaucratic indifference of someone following orders he did not necessarily understand. "All commercial activities involving food preparation and public gathering require proper documentation and safety inspections." The timing was too convenient and the regulations too specific to be coincidental. Pike had found a way to use territorial authority to create legal justification for shutting down their event, transforming his personal vendetta into official government action that could not be easily challenged or appealed. But the community response to this interference revealed the depth of commitment that Pike had failed to anticipate. Families who had traveled significant distances to attend the fair were not prepared to accept a bureaucratic harassment that threatened their investment in the Silver Spur's success. Ranch owners who had contributed goods and labor understood that allowing Pike to succeed would establish precedents that could be used against any of them in similar circumstances. "These regulations don't exist," declared Margaret Henderson, whose preserve business had made her knowledgeable about territorial commercial requirements. "I've been selling goods at public events for 12 years, and there's no such thing as emergency licensing for temporary sales." Her challenge was supported by other vendors who had extensive experience with legitimate territorial regulations. The deputy found himself facing not a single family that could be intimidated through official pressure, but an entire community that understood the difference between real law enforcement and corruption disguised as bureaucratic procedure. The administrative battle continued on the main grounds. Emma noticed unusual activity near the cattle pastures that bordered the fair area. Riders had appeared on the ridgeline above the south pasture, men whose presence seemed inconsistent with the casual attendance that characterized other fair visitors. "Mama," she said urgently, tugging at Cora's skirt as her mother negotiated. "With suppliers for additional baking materials, there are strange men near the cattle. They don't look like they're here for the fair." Cora followed Emma's gaze toward the distant riders, her maternal instincts immediately alert to potential danger. The men sat their horses with the professional stillness of cowboys, conducting surveillance rather than the relaxed posture of people enjoying entertainment. More concerning, they were positioned exactly where they could observe the cattle herds without being easily seen by most fair attendees. "Find Mr. Morrison," Cora instructed Emma with the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis. "Tell him what you saw, and then stay close to Josie near the house." The warning came just in time. As Emma reached Chuck Morrison with her report, the sound of running cattle began echoing from the direction of the south pasture. What started as distant rumbling quickly grew into the unmistakable thunder of a stampede directed toward the heart of the harvest fair. Pike's plan became clear with devastating simplicity. Unable to shut down the fair through legal harassment, he had resorted to the direct sabotage of driving cattle through the event grounds. The stampede would scatter families, destroy vendor booths, and create the kind of chaos that would make continued operation impossible while providing him with plausible deniability about intentional interference. Stampede! Chuck Morrison's warning cry carried across the fair grounds with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was approaching. Everyone to the house! Move quickly, but don't run. The next few minutes would test everything they had planned and prepared for, determining whether months of community building and family formation could survive the kind of direct assault that Pike's desperation had finally produced. The Silver Spur Ranch was about to discover whether love and determination could triumph over violence and corruption, when the stakes included not just financial survival, but the physical safety of everyone who had committed themselves to supporting their cause. As the sound of approaching cattle grew louder and families began moving toward safety with the disciplined urgency of people who understood frontier dangers, Monty realized that the harvest fair had become exactly what Pike intended: a public test of whether ordinary people could resist the forces that sought to steal their dreams and destroy their communities. The outcome would be determined in the next few minutes, and the consequences would echo through Montana territory for years to come. Emma's emergency bell had been a dinner bell until Pike's cattle came thundering toward the heart of the harvest fair, transforming an innocent piece of ranch equipment into the instrument that would save dozens of lives and determine the fate of everything the Silver Spur community had built together. Her small hands grasped the rope with desperate strength as she rang out the warning that would give families precious seconds to reach safety before 200 head of panicked cattle crashed through their celebration. The stampede erupted from the south pasture with the devastating force of a natural disaster. But unlike earthquakes or storms, this catastrophe had been deliberately engineered by men who had calculated that violence would succeed where legal corruption had failed. Pike's riders had positioned themselves perfectly to drive the cattle toward the main fair grounds, using techniques that would scatter families and destroy vendor booths while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional sabotage. Morrison's security preparations had anticipated many forms of interference, but the scale and speed of a full cattle stampede created challenges that no amount of planning could completely address. His shouted warnings helped coordinate the evacuation, but the success of their response would depend on how quickly families could move from the exposed fairgrounds to the relative safety of the ranch buildings. Everyone to the house. Morrison's voice carried across the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Stay together and move fast. The sound of approaching hooves had grown from distant rumbling to earth-shaking thunder as 200 head of cattle bore down on the fair grounds with the unstoppable momentum of a natural force. Women gathered children with the practiced efficiency of mothers who understood frontier dangers, while men attempted to protect vendor booths and equipment that represented significant community investment. Cora's baking tent stood directly in a path of the stampeding herd. 3 days' worth of preparation and ingredients about to be destroyed by Pike's calculated assault on their community gathering. She made a desperate attempt to salvage what she could, grabbing baskets of finished goods, while Emma continued ringing the bell that had become their lifeline to coordinated survival. "Mama, leave it," Emma called out with the urgent clarity of someone who understood that material possessions could be replaced, but mothers could not. The cattle are too close. But Cora's determination to save their revenue-generating baking reflected the deeper reality that losing the tent's contents meant losing their ability to meet the financial obligations that would determine the Silver Spur's survival. Every pie and cake represented money they desperately needed, and abandoning them felt like surrendering to Pike's strategy of economic destruction. The decision was made for her as the first cattle crested the small rise that separated the pasture from the fair grounds. The sight of 200 panicked animals charging toward the celebration created a moment of terrible clarity about priorities and survival. Cora dropped her salvage efforts and ran toward the house, joining the stream of families whose weekend celebration had become a desperate evacuation. Josie had been stationed at her financial command post on the front porch when Emma's bell began ringing her careful ledgers and revenue calculations suddenly irrelevant in the face of immediate physical danger. But even as she gathered her precious records and prepared to retreat to the house's interior, her mathematical mind continued processing the implications of what was happening. "They're coming from the south pasture," she called out to anyone who could hear her analysis. "That means they'll hit the baking tent first, then the ice cream station, then the main vendor area." Her prediction proved devastatingly accurate as the leading edge of the stampede reached Cora's baking tent and transformed it into a chaos of scattered ingredients and destroyed equipment. Tables overturned, canvas ripped, and carefully prepared foods scattered across the ground as hooves and horns cleared the area with brutal efficiency. The ice cream station and Emma's rebuilt springhouse stood directly in the next wave of destruction, representing not just lost revenue, but the destruction of the physical improvements that had made their entire enterprise possible. Emma watched in horror as the cattle approached the structure she had helped design and rebuild, her discovery about to be eliminated by Pike's assault on their community. But the springhouses' stone construction proved more resilient than the Yasalini. Temporary vendor booths. The cattle flowed around the solid structure like water around a boulder, their momentum carrying them past without causing the complete destruction that wooden buildings would have suffered. The cooling equipment and production materials were scattered and damaged, but the essential spring and collection systems remained intact. "The springhouse is still there," Emma shouted with the excitement of someone seeing hope emerge from disaster. "The water's still good." Her observation provided the first indication that Pike's sabotage might not achieve the total destruction he had intended. The stampede was devastating the temporary structures and vendor booths, but the permanent improvements that formed the foundation of their operation were proving more durable than anyone had expected. Meanwhile, Monty and Chuck Morrison attempted to organize a response that might limit the damage and protect families who had not yet reached safety. The ranch hand's experience with cattle management provided some capability for influencing the herd's direction, but the speed and scale of the stampede limited their options for intervention. "Cut them toward the creek," Morrison shouted to Jimmy Martinez, who had positioned himself near the main corral with a rope in the desperate hope of turning at least part of the herd away from the most vulnerable areas. The effort showed limited success as individual cattle responded to familiar handling techniques. But the overall momentum of the stampede continued, carrying the bulk of the herd through the fair grounds with destructive force that scattered everything in its path. From the relative safety of the ranch house porch, families watched their community celebration transform into a scene of devastation that represented far more than economic loss. The harvest fair had become a symbol of resistance to Pike's corruption, and its destruction felt like a victory for the forces of greed and intimidation that threatened everyone's independence and security. "Look," Emma said quietly, pointing toward the ridgeline where Pike's riders remained visible as distant silhouettes against the autumn sky. "They're watching. They wanted this to happen." The observation crystallized everyone's understanding that they were witnessing not an accident or natural disaster, but a deliberately planned assault on their community and values. Pike had escalated beyond legal harassment and economic pressure to direct violence that threatened the physical safety of families who had committed themselves to supporting the Silver Spur's survival. But even as the immediate destruction continued, signs of resilience and adaptation began emerging from the chaos. Families who had reached safety started organizing salvage efforts and damage assessment. Women began planning ways to continue food service with improvised equipment and alternative locations. Men evaluated what could be repaired quickly and what would need to be abandoned or replaced. "We're not finished," Cora announced with the determined authority of someone who had faced catastrophic loss before and survived. "We've got hours of daylight left, and people came here expecting a fair. Pike destroyed our setup, but he didn't destroy our community." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood that their response to Pike's sabotage would determine not just the day's financial outcome, but the long-term viability of their resistance to corruption and intimidation. The harvest fair could still succeed if they could adapt quickly enough to demonstrate that violence could not destroy what determination and cooperation had built. Cora's salvaged flour sack had become the foundation for an entirely new creation. The key ingredient in what would become known throughout Montana Territory as crumb pudding, a dessert born from disaster and transformed through ingenuity into something more valuable than anything Pike's sabotage had destroyed. As families emerged from the ranch house to survey the devastation left by the stampede, Cora stood among the scattered remains of her baking tent with the focused determination of someone who refused to accept defeat, a sight that greeted the all. Fair attendees would have discouraged most people beyond any hope of recovery. Tables lay overturned and splintered, canvas hung in tatters from broken poles, and carefully prepared foods had been ground into the dirt by hundreds of hooves. The beautiful displays that had showcased days of preparation were reduced to debris. That seemed to represent the complete failure of their resistance to Pike's corruption. But Emma's quick thinking during the stampede had preserved more than anyone initially realized. Her knowledge of water flow and natural drainage had led her to position salvageable materials on slightly elevated ground that the cattle had avoided. During their chaotic passage, bags of flour, containers of sugar, and essential baking supplies had survived the destruction, scattered but largely intact. "Look, Mama," Emma called out excitedly, her natural optimism asserting itself despite the surrounding devastation. "The important things are still here. We just need to put them back together differently." Her observation sparked the kind of creative problem-solving that had characterized their entire relationship with the Silver Spur Ranch. Instead of attempting to recreate what had been destroyed, they would adapt to the new circumstances and create something unprecedented, a harvest fair that demonstrated community resilience in the face of direct assault. Josie approached the challenge with her characteristic mathematical precision, calculating quantities and proportions with the materials that remained available. "We have enough flour for approximately 40 portions if we adjust the recipe ratios," she announced, consulting notes that had somehow survived the chaos. "But we need a new cooking method since the ovens are damaged." The solution came from an unexpected source as neighboring families stepped forward with equipment and expertise that transformed limitation into opportunity. Ranch wives produced Dutch ovens and cooking implements from their wagons. Men constructed improvised cooking surfaces using salvaged materials, and children organized themselves into efficient work groups that maximized available resources. "Dutch oven cooking makes everything taste better anyway," declared Mrs. Henderson with the practical wisdom of someone who had fed families under challenging circumstances for decades. "We'll cook over open fires the way our grandmothers did, and people will pay extra for the authentic frontier experience." The transformation that followed exceeded anything they had planned during their weeks of careful preparation. The formal vendor booths were replaced by informal family circles, where cooking became entertainment and community interaction. The rigid commercial structure of the original fair evolved into something more organic and participatory, drawing attendees into the creation process, rather than treating them as passive consumers. Emma's springhouse became the centerpiece of the improvised operations, its stone construction having survived the stampede with minimal damage. The ice cream production resumed within hours, but now the process itself became part of the attraction as families watched Emma demonstrate the techniques she had developed through weeks of experimentation. "The secret is timing," she explained to fascinated children whose parents had gathered to observe the young expert at work. "You have to add the salt at exactly the right moment, and you have to keep stirring even when your arms get tired." Her natural teaching ability transformed technical instruction into entertainment that justified premium pricing while educating the next generation of frontier families. Children who had come expecting simple treats left with knowledge about thermodynamics, food preservation, and the practical applications of natural resources. Cora's crumb pudding represented the most dramatic innovation emerging from the disaster. Using the scattered remains of destroyed pastries combined with salvaged ingredients, she created a dessert that was entirely new while incorporating familiar flavors that appealed to frontier palates accustomed to resourceful cooking. "It's like everything good that was destroyed came back together in a new way," one customer observed after tasting the unusual creation. "It's better than what we lost." The comment captured something profound about their response to Pike's sabotage. Instead of simply rebuilding what had been destroyed, they had created something better through adaptation and community cooperation. The Harvest Fair had become a demonstration of resilience that was more powerful than the original plan could have achieved. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the improvised fair began generating revenue that exceeded their original projections. Despite the apparent devastation of the morning stampede, families who had initially come for entertainment found themselves participating in a community demonstration that would be remembered for years as an example of how ordinary people could triumph over deliberate attempts to destroy their cooperation and independence. Pike's riders remained visible on the distant ridgeline, their continued presence serving as a reminder that the day's conflict was not yet resolved. But their passive observation suggested that the stampede had been their primary strategy, and its failure to achieve decisive victory had left them without obvious options for escalation. "They're just watching now," Chuck Morrison observed as he coordinated security patrols that kept the distant riders under surveillance. "Pike didn't expect us to recover this quickly." The territorial deputy who had attempted to shut down the fair through bureaucratic harassment had disappeared during the chaos of the stampede, his official intervention rendered irrelevant by events that had moved far beyond the scope of licensing regulations and administrative procedures. His absence confirmed what everyone had suspected. His appearance had been coordinated with Pike's sabotage, rather than representing legitimate law enforcement. As the sun began setting over the mountains, casting the improvised fair in the golden light of autumn evening, Josie completed her final revenue calculations with results that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The combination of increased attendance, premium pricing for authentic frontier experiences, and community donations had generated enough money to meet their tax obligations with a substantial surplus remaining. "We did it," she announced quietly, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who had watched mathematical projections transform into practical reality. "We raised enough money to save the ranch." But even as families celebrated their financial success, the deeper significance of their achievement was becoming clear to everyone who had participated in the day's events. They had demonstrated that community cooperation could triumph over individual corruption, that adaptation and resilience could transform apparent defeat into decisive victory. The Harvest Fair had become more than a fundraising event. It had become a public declaration that the values represented by the Silver Spur Ranch would continue to thrive in Montana territory, despite the best efforts of those who sought to destroy them through violence and intimidation. As evening settled over the ranch and families began the process of cleaning up and preparing for departure, Cora found herself standing beside Monty in the spot where her baking tent had been destroyed that morning. The devastation was still visible, but it no longer represented defeat. Instead, it represented the beginning of something new and better than anything they had originally planned. "Pike's sabotage failed," Monty observed with quiet satisfaction. "Not only did we raise the money, but we exposed his methods to the entire region. He'll never be able to claim legitimacy for his expansion efforts after today." "More than that," Cora replied, her hand finding his with the natural gesture of someone no longer fighting the inevitable. "We proved that we're stronger together than any force that tries to tear us apart." The moment carried the weight of everything they had built together, not just the romantic relationship that circumstances had prevented them from exploring fully, but the family unit that had emerged from desperation and been strengthened through shared adversity. The twins, exhausted but triumphant from their day of technical expertise and community leadership, represented the future that their resistance had been designed to protect. As the last families departed with promises to spread word of the Silver Spur's victory throughout the territory, the ranch settled into an evening quiet that felt entirely different from the loneliness that had characterized Monty's previous existence. The sounds that filled the twilight were the sounds of home children's voices, adult conversation, and the satisfied bustle of people who had accomplished something significant together. The Harvest Fair was over, but its impact would resonate through Montana territory for years to come, establishing precedents for community resistance that would influence how frontier families responded to similar threats in the future. Emma's new family portrait sketch would hang in the Silver Spur Ranch kitchen for generations to come. A child's drawing that captured the essential truth of what four strangers had built together, through circumstances none of them could have anticipated. The pencil lines showed all four of them standing on the ranch house porch, Monty tall and strong, Cora graceful and determined, Josie serious with her notebook, and Emma grinning beside her beloved spring house. It was not sophisticated art, but it was perfect truth. The morning after the harvest fair dawned with the crisp clarity that often follows significant storms, both meteorological and emotional. The Silver Spur Ranch showed signs of the previous day's chaos-scattered debris, makeshift repairs, and the pleasant exhaustion that accompanies successful but demanding celebrations. But it also showed something entirely new, the unmistakable character of a place that had been transformed from a lonely businessman's retreat into the center of a thriving community. Territorial Marshal William Hayes arrived at the ranch just after breakfast, his official investigation into land titles and water rights having taken on new urgency following reports of the previous day's events. But instead of the corrupt official that Pike's influence had led everyone to expect, Hayes proved to be a career lawman whose integrity had earned him appointment to territorial service, specifically because he could not be bought or intimidated. Mr. Halle, the marshal said, as he dismounted from his horse and surveyed the ranch with the professional eye of someone accustomed to evaluating complex situations. I believe we need to discuss some irregularities in the documentation surrounding your property boundaries. The conversation that followed in Monty's study revealed the full extent of Pike's corruption and the effectiveness of the community response that had exposed it. Hayes produced the forged property survey that Pike had submitted to territorial authorities, pointing out discrepancies that had become obvious once expert examination was applied to the fraudulent documentation. The forgery is actually quite sophisticated, Hayes explained, spreading the documents across Monty's desk with the care of someone handling criminal evidence. But whoever created it made the mistake of altering boundary markers that were established by federal survey teams. That kind of documentation is much harder to falsify convincingly. More importantly, the marshal's investigation had revealed the broader pattern of corruption that Pike had used to acquire neighboring properties throughout the region. The Silver Spur case had provided the evidence needed to expose fraudulent tax assessments, forged documents, and intimidation tactics that violated both territorial and federal law. Mr. Pike is currently being held in Helena, pending federal charges. Hayes continued with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a difficult investigation. The territorial governor has ordered a comprehensive review of all land transactions in this region over the past 5 years. The news meant more than just Pike's removal as a threat to the Silver Spur. It meant vindication for every family that had suffered under his expansion efforts, and it established legal precedents that would protect future settlers from similar corruption. The harvest fair's success had accomplished far more than raising money. It had triggered systemic reform that would benefit the entire territory. As Marshal Hayes completed his official business and prepared to depart, he paused to acknowledge what the Silver Spur community had accomplished through their resistance. What you did yesterday, he told Monty and Cora as they stood together on the front porch, that took real courage. And it made my job possible. Sometimes justice needs a little help from people who refuse to be intimidated. The financial implications of their victory were immediately apparent as Josie completed her final accounting of the harvest fair's revenue. The event had generated enough money to pay the inflated tax assessment, with a substantial surplus remaining for ranch improvements and expansion. More importantly, the exposure of Pike's corruption meant that future tax obligations would be based on legitimate assessments rather than fraudulent valuations designed to force bankruptcy. We can afford to expand the cattle operation by 30%, Josie announced with the satisfaction of someone whose mathematical projections had been validated by practical results. And we have enough left over to build a proper school for the ranch children. The mention of a school crystallized plans that had been developing gradually throughout their weeks of community building. The Silver Spur had attracted enough families to justify educational facilities that would serve children throughout the region, creating an institutional foundation for the community that had emerged from their resistance to Pike's corruption. Emma's Springhouse had become the symbol of their transformation, representing both the discovery that had made their financial salvation possible and the innovation that had turned Pike's sabotage into demonstration of community resilience. Plans were already underway to expand the facility into a proper ice house that could serve regional commercial needs while maintaining the personal significance that made it special to the family that had discovered it. "I want to build a bigger collection basin," Emma announced with the authority of someone whose expertise had been proven through practical application, "and maybe a water wheel to help with the ice making. I have drawings." Her technical enthusiasm had evolved into genuine engineering skill that impressed adult craftsmen who initially had been skeptical of taking direction from a 6-year-old. Emma's intuitive understanding of water systems and thermodynamics suggested possibilities for mechanical innovations that could establish the Silver Spur as a regional center for ice production and food preservation. The community celebration that evening brought together families from throughout the territory, many of whom had traveled significant distances to participate in what had become an impromptu victory festival. The barn had been cleared and decorated for dancing. Tables were laden with food that showcased the culinary traditions of frontier families, and children played games that would be remembered as marking the end of Pike's reign of intimidation. But the most significant moment of the evening came when Monty stood before the assembled community and made the announcement that everyone had been hoping to hear. With Cora beside him and the twins watching from the front row of gathered families, he formally proposed marriage and permanent family formation that would transform their temporary arrangement into lasting commitment. "When I advertised for a cook," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the barn, filled with friends and neighbors, "I was looking for someone to fill my kitchen. What I found was someone to fill my life." Cora's acceptance created celebration that exceeded even the afternoon's victory over Pike's corruption. The engagement represented not just personal happiness for two people who had found love in desperate circumstances, but the completion of connections that had been forged through shared adversity and community support. The twins' reaction demonstrated their understanding that the engagement meant permanent security and belonging rather than the temporary arrangement that had characterized their arrival at the Silver Spur. Josie's mathematical mind had long since calculated the practical advantages of family formation, while Emma's adventurous spirit had always assumed that people who belonged together would eventually recognize that fact. "Does this mean we get to keep the Springhouse forever?" Emma asked with the directness that characterized all her approaches to important questions. "Forever and always," Monty confirmed, kneeling to address her at eye level with the respect due to someone whose discoveries had made their victory possible. "It's your Springhouse, and this is your home for as long as you want it to be." The wedding that followed 3 weeks later brought together the largest gathering in Montana Territory's recent history, a celebration that marked not just the union of two people, but the establishment of community institutions that would influence regional development for decades to come. The Silver Spur Ranch had become more than a cattle operation. It had become the center of a network of relationships and mutual support that represented the best possibilities of frontier life. The ceremony itself took place beneath the cottonwood trees near Emma's Springhouse, with territorial officials, neighboring ranchers, and children from throughout the region witnessing the exchange of vows that formalized commitments that had been tested through crisis and proven through shared adversity. The marriage created not just a new family unit, but a demonstration of how love could triumph over the forces of greed and corruption that threatened individual happiness and community stability. As winter settled over the ranch and the newly formed family established routines that would carry them through the quiet months ahead, the kitchen became the heart of a home that had finally fulfilled its original architectural promise. The sounds that filled the evening air were the sounds of family life, children's homework discussions, adult planning conversations, and the comfortable domestic bustle that transforms a house into a sanctuary. Cora's recipe book lay open on the kitchen counter, its pages no longer representing memories of loss, but foundations for future creation. New recipes appeared regularly, documenting the culinary innovations that emerged from combining frontier practicality with family traditions. The book had become a living record of adaptation and growth, rather than a static memorial to the past. Monty's studies showed similar transformation as Josie's organizational systems evolved to accommodate expanded operations and increased complexity. The chaotic records that had once reflected solitary struggle were replaced by methodical documentation that tracked not just financial performance, but community relationships and mutual obligations that extended far beyond simple commercial transactions. The Silver Spur Ranch had become exactly what Jonathan Hawley and Thomas Whitfield had envisioned during their military service years. Earlier, a place where families could build security through mutual support and shared commitment to values that transcended individual advantage. The ranch represented continuity with the past and hope for the future, demonstrating that the sacrifice of previous generations could provide foundations for achievements that exceeded their original dreams. As spring returned to Montana territory, and Emma began planning improvements to her spring house that would incorporate lessons learned through a winter of reflection and design development. The family gathered around the kitchen table for their traditional evening discussions that had become the foundation of their shared decision-making process. What should we build next? Emma asked with the enthusiasm of someone whose discoveries had already transformed their world once, and might do so again. The question carried implications that extended far beyond immediate practical concerns. The Silver Spur had become a symbol of what frontier families could accomplish when they refused to surrender to corruption and intimidation. Their success had established precedents and relationships that would influence regional development for generations to come. Whatever we build, Cora said, looking around the table at the family that circumstances had brought together and love had made permanent, we'll build it together. The simple words carried the weight of everything they had learned about the true sources of security and happiness. Material success was important, but it meant nothing without the relationships that gave it meaning and purpose. The Silver Spur Ranch was valuable not because of its size or profitability, but because it had become home to people who understood that true wealth was measured in the hearts, gathered around a family table rather than the cattle counted in distant pastures. Outside, the Montana evenings settled over the ranch with the peaceful quiet of a world that had been tested and found strong. Inside the warm circle of lamplight that surrounded the kitchen table, four people who had found each other through desperation and chosen each other through love continued the conversations that would shape their shared future and honor the memory of those who had sacrificed to make their happiness possible. The Silver Spur Ranch had finally become what it was always meant to be, not just a successful business enterprise, but a true home where love triumphed over loneliness and community values prevailed over individual greed. The story that had begun with a simple want advertisement had evolved into something far more significant, proof that the best dreams require not just individual achievement, but the courage to share them with others who understand that some treasures can only be protected through mutual commitment and unwavering faith in the power of families to overcome any obstacle that threatens their unity.